That's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it.
We can absolutely grow and have grown, and the evidence is overwhelming that we have grown the output of goods and services.
None of this seems very American. All of it looks like the actual end of democracy.
Trump's ominous warning paints a grim picture of a nation on the brink of chaos, hinting at impending turmoil and unrest.
They said they're following the science. They tell us the border's secure. There wasn't any inflation.
Elon Musk reflects on progress, acknowledging the strides humanity has made in prosperity and innovation compared to bygone eras.
One disturbing conversation was, saying that that we deserve to have the trade towers because of our terrible foreign policy. And I was like, this is what they're teaching you in elite New York high schools? This is messed up.
Leaders in every adult country on the planet understand that what he's saying is nonsense, if not totally insane. Because these are people with economies they need to tend to and people they need to feed. They don't have time for self-harm. China, for example, burns more coal each year than the rest of the world combined, and that will not change. In fact, it's accelerating.
With a sense of urgency, Trump admonishes leaders, asserting that prolonged inaction will only exacerbate the country's woes.
And we're not going to stand for it. We're going to turn this around, and we're going to turn it around fast. Somebody said, we really like this person or that person because they can serve for 8 years. They should serve. I said, if it takes you more than a year to fix the problem, you have the wrong people. That was actually something. That was a political attack line, JD. They said he could be here for 8 years. I said, if it takes you more than a year, you got the wrong guy.
Biden's economic policies come under fire as Trump suggests they've plunged America into uncharted territory, leaving citizens grappling with unfamiliar hardships.
Breaking late tonight, Oversight Chair James Comer says he's inviting President Biden to testify before the committee about his family's business dealings. That same committee today held a hearing that his son Hunter Biden begged for. Remember how he said he wanted to clear his name in public? Well, in true Hunter fashion, he did not keep his commitment.
Trump laments the decline of once great American institutions like United States Steel, underscoring the erosion of industrial prowess over time.
I said, if it takes you 8 years to set this thing up, you don't want to vote for him. So that's the story. It's my first term, and we built the greatest economy. Think of it. In my first term, we built the greatest economy in the history of the world. We had the highest tax cut ever. Ronald Reagan didn't do anything even by comparison. We had the biggest regulation cuts and rising wages for citizens of every race, religion, color, and creed. And we had a thing called no inflation. How do you like the idea of no inflation? Under Biden, the cost of rent is up 30%. Groceries are up 30%. Everything is up. Chicken's up. Bread is up. And I can't read this damn teleprompter.
The Biden lift, something Americans aren't familiar with since Joe's Bidenomics has driven our economy into the ground. But his family's pockets apparently kept getting bigger with each shell company deposit. Remember the infamous 10 held by H for the big guy email? Hunter had denied knowing what any of it meant and who the big guy was.
Elon Musk weighs in on moral standards, urging society to eschew the binary labels of oppressed and oppressor in favor of absolute moral principles.
Well, I think we really need to stop this principle that the weaker, normally weaker party is always right. This is simply not true. If you are in quotes oppressed or the weaker party, it doesn't mean you're right. Because if some of those, weaker groups want to annihilate you, that does not make them good. We have to get rid of the rule that if you're weaker, you're automatically good. That's obviously makes no sense. It often makes sense where it's like, okay, you don't want to beat up on someone smaller and weaker than you. But if that smaller group wants to kill you, they're bad. Okay. I'm a big believer in moral absolutism, not moral relativism. There's good and bad in the absolute, and you judge any group or individual against absolute moral standards, not whether they're the so-called oppressed or oppressor, just on absolute moral terms. Are they doing good things? Do they want to murder innocent people? That's bad. It doesn't matter who they are.
Against a backdrop of uncertainty, Trump's courtroom appearance serves as a stark reminder of the political machinations shaping the nation's future.
And the head of the United Auto Workers never probably shook hands with a Republican before. They're destroying. You know, Mexico has taken over a period of 30 years, 34% of the automobile manufacturing business in our country. Think of it. Went to Mexico. China now is building a couple of massive plants where they're going to build the cars in Mexico and they think that they're going to sell those cars into the United States with no tax at the border. Let me tell you something to China. If you're listening, President Xi, and you and I are friends, but he understands the way I deal, those big monster car manufacturing plants that you're building in Mexico right now, and you think you're going to get that, you're going to not hire Americans, and you're going to sell the cars to us. No, we're going to put a 100% tariff on every single car that comes across the line, and you're not going to be able to sell those cars.
A call to skepticism echoes as the narrative questions blind trust in so-called experts, highlighting the pitfalls of uncritical reliance on authority.
How dare the press consent to being questioned? Reporters did the legwork. They write the truth. They're experts. But what's the legwork? They wrote what the CIA told them. They called a Democrat for a quote. They wrote the same thing their colleagues wrote. What kind of research did journalists do before they wrote Trump colluded with Russia? Well, they're experts at regurgitating hoaxes. Russia, laptop, lab leak. Journalists told us school closings were good for kids. They could Zoom for 7th and 8th grade. If we had just listened to Johnny Spaghetti Stain calling BS on reporters for the last 4 years, we would have been right on everything. And we were. Calling BS is the scientific method. You question everything until you can prove it. The journalists are supposed to call BS on the system. They're not supposed to defend the system and discredit Johnny Spaghetti Stain for calling BS on them. Elon Musk, right? Dedicating his life to disrupting the system, innovating and protecting free speech. Don Lemon, a so-called journalist, is advocating for censorship and slanders Musk on behalf of the system, a system seeking to eliminate debate. Musk called BS on Lemon and exposed his narcissistic demands. Remember, he wanted a free truck, a ride into space, millions in cash, and an equity stake.
Where are the energy companies, the oil and gas companies in this? You would think, since they're famously profitable and big, some of the biggest companies in the world, that they would be making a lot of noise pushing back. They do in subtle ways, but they don't do it in public. Why is that?
Well, they've basically been bullied into submission. And so you've seen the ESG movement has basically convinced the world that natural gas are bad and that, solar panels made by Uyghur Muslims in China and wind turbines, which are threatening to make the North Atlantic right whale extinct in the United States, that those are somehow better for the environment. It's a complete corruption of science, of rationality. Anybody can see that natural gas and are the superior forms of energy, but the ESG movement has used political activism to put pressure and also used pension funds to put pressure on the oil and gas industries to basically sell out their main product. I mean, here you have it's actually in many cases cheaper. I mean, natural gas is so abundant in the United States. It should be one of our greatest export commodities. And so they've gotten the pension funds organized through ESG. They've gotten the political actors like Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, to campaign against oil and gas, even though it's been the biggest driver of carbon emissions reductions over the last 20 years. And not just in the United States. I mean, people don't know that carbon emissions peaked in Britain and France and Germany in the mid-70s, mostly because of natural gas. And so I think you've just seen, cowardice set in response to some pretty intense ESG bullying by activist pension funds and by, frankly, sociopathic political leaders like Gavin Newsom.
Doubts cast on the democratic process intensify as Trump's legal battles hint at systemic efforts to undermine his political ambitions.
If I get elected, now if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole, but they're not going to sell those cars. They're building massive factories. A friend of mine, all he does is build car manufacturing plants. He's the biggest in the world. I mean, honestly, I joke about it. He can't walk across the street, and that way he's like Biden. But for building a plant, he can do the greatest plants in the world, right? That's all he cares about. I said, I'd like to see one of your plants recently. I said, I'd like to see, where can we go? Well, we have to travel to Mexico. I said, why Mexico? He said, because that's where the big plants are building. China's building really big plants in Mexico, and Mexico's building. What about here? Well, we're building much smaller plants here. Can you believe it? Can you believe it? So what they're saying, Jim Jordan, is that we're going to make cars in Mexico, and they're going to do, you're not going to stand for that, Bernie, JD. I have a feeling JD's not big into that policy. 100% tariff. They won't sell any cars over here. And I'll tell them, if they want to build a plant in Michigan, in Ohio, in South Carolina, they can, using American workers. They can. They can't send Chinese workers over here, which they sometimes do. But if they want to do that, we're welcome, right? But they're not going to build them in Mexico, and they're not going to do that. We're going to tariff them at 100%, just like I've done. I saved the steel industry. The people that like me the most are the steel companies. But now I've been out for a little while, and guess what? United States Steel, 50 years, 60 years ago, maybe the greatest company in the world.
Elon Musk emerges as a disruptor, championing innovation and defending the principles of free speech against systemic constraints.
Yeah, I think generally people should always be wary that they may have either consciously or perhaps mostly subconsciously internalized the notion of a zero-sum game or a fixed pie. And if you internalize that everything's zero-sum, meaning like in order for me to get ahead, someone else has to not get ahead, or for me to have stuff, someone else must not have stuff. If you have that axiomatic flaw, then that's what needs to be done is to fix that axiomatic flaw, because it is false. It's not a zero-sum game. We can absolutely grow and have grown, and the evidence is overwhelming that we have grown the output of goods and services. We have many things today that we did not have in the past. We are far more prosperous. All of humanity is far more prosperous today than it was at times in the past. I mean, it wasn't that long ago where, we'd count a good year as one where, well, the bubonic plague wasn't that bad, only 10%. Not that many people starved through the winter. We only lost, 5% of our population due to raids from other tribes. Basically life used to be very rough in the old days. If they could see us now, they'd be like, what are you guys complaining about? This is amazing. Not having to worry about food for, we were food constrained for, probably the last 100,000 years until recently. So, really the present day future is amazing compared to the past. And anyone who doesn't think it's amazing is not a good student of history. So I think we live in the most interesting of times and probably the best of times.
Liberals are now telling us they plan to protect American democracy, and that's the clearest possible sign that they intend to end it. 13 months from this week, the United States will hold a national election. In a democracy, citizens can vote for the candidate of their choice. That's not just a feature, it's the defining fact of the electoral system. The people rule. They can send anyone they want to Washington because they're in charge. But this year, in the name of protecting democracy, liberals have decided to strip Donald Trump's name from the ballot in states across the country. Trump is the front runner in the presidential race. He's currently beating Joe Biden in the polls. Yet liberals have decided that you should not be allowed to elect him president. That's not democracy, it's the opposite. It's totalitarianism. Just this morning, Donald Trump appeared in court in New York in a civil case brought by the state's attorney general that was designed explicitly to keep him out of the White House. That case is part of a larger legal barrage against Trump that so far includes a total of 91 felony counts, every one of them politically motivated. But today's civil case is especially absurd. In fact, it's hard to overstate its ridiculousness. In sum, Trump stands accused of inflating the value of collateral used to secure loans that he has already paid back with interest. In other words, there is no injured party in this case. The biggest banks in the world assessed the risk and they made a profit, as they almost always do. Not a single person was defrauded. For this Trump and his children are in the process of losing their homes and their businesses.